Hey guys, this is Pastor Chris, and I am here at the church getting set up to film this week's message. This is actually going to be my second time filming it. I filmed it yesterday at my seminary, Central Baptist Theological Seminary over in Shawnee. It's a part of the story I tell, and they've got this beautiful library. So I went there and I filmed it, and I got home last night to edit everything and discovered that the audio was messed up. It was completely unusable. So here we are at the church getting ready to do it all over again. And while it's going to be a lot of work and I'm a little bit tired, I'm really excited because we're continuing our series, What Do We Do with the Old Testament? This is actually the third of the 4 weeks, and it's entitled A New Ethic. And as I was trying to figure out how to preach this, I kind of wanted to base it around 4 questions. 4 questions that I'm going to ask you. The first one is, the title of the series, What Do We Do with the Old Testament? And I like this question because I think it's really relatable. If you've been a Christian for a little while, or you've read any bit of Scripture, especially the first half, you've probably found yourself asking that question or a variation of it because, let's be honest, there's some weird stuff in here. There's some really odd and obscure verses. Yeah, there are beautiful verses that would look great on a poster or a paperweight, like Jeremiah 29:11, but then there are also verses like Deuteronomy 23:1. And I'll let you look that one up on your own. I kind of wanted to do this thing to open this series up where I took like the 10 weirdest verses in the Old Testament and I sat down and I read them kind of like a top 10 list. But I decided not to do that for a couple reasons. One, I've worked with youth too long, and I still sometimes think like a middle school boy, and I didn't think I could get through it without giggling. And two, I worried that if I did get through it, that YouTube would put the explicit tag on this video because some of those verses are like that. So, some of them are so crazy. I've always wanted to do this thing. And I shouldn't tell you this, and we definitely shouldn't tell Pastor Dan this, but I have this app on my phone over there. It's a Bible app called YouVersion, and it's a great tool for studying Scripture. And it's got this feature where you can take a verse, like any verse in the Bible, and turn it into an image to share on Instagram. You pick like a pretty background and a pretty font, and you put them together, and there you go. And when you do it, all of your followers can see it and also share it. And I just wanted to take like 1 week where I make those images, but I only make them using those weird, odd, obscure verses in the Old Testament just to see if anyone catches on. I probably shouldn't do that. But all joking aside, it's a very real question. What do we do with the Old Testament? What do we do with those weird parts? The odd and obscure verses. You know, I've had times where I was left wondering, why is God saying that to them? Or why are they saying that to God? What am I supposed to do with this? And I'm just left really confused about maybe certain parts of my faith or certain parts of the Bible. And so that's that first question that I wanted to ask. What do we do with the Old Testament? And now the second question that I want to ask is actually one that Andy Stanley asked in the introduction to the book Irresistible, which is the book this series is based on. We've been studying it. We're doing small groups on Sunday and Wednesday evenings, and It's been incredible. It's sparked a lot of really good conversation. If you don't have the book, I encourage you to click on the notes tab or look in the notes section and you'll find a link where you can order it and even get involved in one of those small groups. But in the first few pages of the book, Andy tells this story where he's traveling overseas and a young girl recognizes him. She knows who he is from his ministry work, and she asks him a question. She looks at him and says, "Why don't all Americans go to church?" And that was the question that sparked him to write this. But it's a question that really hits home for me, because I think I know the answer, or a small part of the answer. I think there are a lot of Americans who don't go to church because they've had a bad church experience. In fact, I would guess that if we divided up everyone watching this video into small groups, and I went around to each of those small groups, and I sat down and I just asked, does anybody here have a story about a bad experience they had with a church? Or tell me your church horror stories. And I bet you every one of those groups we could talk for hours. I bet you I could walk across the street to the hospital over there and just start asking random strangers, and I would still get stories. Because that's how many of us have had bad church experiences. Now, a lot of you know my story. You know that I grew up Southern Baptist, and as part of that, I went to church a lot, like a whole lot. If the church was open, we were there. And I kind of hated that growing up, but I look back and there was a lot of benefit to it. I had a good church, so good that when I was in the youth group, I started to feel a call to ministry. To work in a church, to be a pastor. But towards the end of my time there was a couple things that happened that were really difficult for me. But then I went off to Bible school and I graduated and I took my first job in a church in central Missouri. And I don't say this to talk bad about anybody at the church. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, and so I'm not going to get into any of the details, but I will say this. There were things going on in the leadership there that shouldn't have been going on in the leadership there. And on top of that, I felt like my beliefs were beginning to move one direction, and the denomination that the church was a part of, their beliefs were beginning to move a different direction. And so after just 9 months of being there, I made the difficult decision to leave, which was really tough. I had only been married 1 month, and I looked at Sally and I just said, I don't think this is the place for us. And she agreed, and we made the move to Springfield, Missouri, and I got a job. It started out as a temp job and turned into a permanent job as an associate underwriter at an insurance company. I spent 3.5 years sitting in a cubicle, and it went exactly like you think it would go. But the reason I stayed there so long is because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew that I still loved God, but I didn't know if I still loved the church or the idea of working in a church. See, for me, God, Jesus, the gospel, the good news, that was still irresistible. But the church had become very resistible. And I didn't know if I wanted to be a part of it anymore. And so when I read that question, why don't all Americans go to church? I really connected with it. And I bet that there are some of you that also connect with it. And so we're going to keep moving along here. Now, the third question that I'm going to talk about in this sermon here in a few minutes is one that Andy talks about in the third section of the book. And he says it's a question he's asked a lot as a pastor. And when I read that, I had to laugh because I too have been asked that question more times than I can count. And that question is this: is blank, fill in the blank, a sin? And people get very concerned with this question, and they ask it a lot. Is blank, fill in the blank, a sin? Because, see, they don't want to sin, but they also don't want to miss out on some of the fun that they might be able to have. And so the question is, where is that line? Or when I work with youth, there's almost a bit of a follow-up to that question, where it's, how far is too far? And not to throw youth under the bus, but when they ask it, it's usually in the context of dating, because they want to know, how much can I do before I've done something I shouldn't do? And I bring it up because it sounds really blunt and maybe even a little bit vulgar, but at the heart of it, it's the same thing that we continue to wonder as adults. How far can I go down that road before I've gone too far? And Andy says that's how a lot of us view our faith. It's a very vertical faith. It's about me and God and making sure that I'm right with God. I remember when I was in middle school. I was in 8th grade, and I was going to try out for the basketball team for the first time, and I really wanted it. So I was praying a lot. I was asking God, please be with me. Please let me make the team. But the whole time that I was praying that, I was so scared. I was paranoid that I was going to sin, that I was going to mess up and do something that upset God, and He wouldn't be with me during tryouts. And so it was almost like I was walking on this tightrope all the time, just trying, is this a sin? Is this a sin? Is that too far? Where is the line? And looking back, that seems really immature, that's how I was thinking about God and concerned about tryouts. But honestly, sometimes faith still feels like that. It's all about me and God, making sure I'm right with God. And so it becomes all about the rules, all about the commandments. As Andy says, the faith becomes sin avoidance. That's the heart of it is avoiding sin. And if you read through the Old Testament, this is where the Israelites often found themselves. Their faith was all about making sure they weren't going to upset God. And so they had rules. In fact, in the Old Testament, there's approximately 613 of them. But even those left some questions, and so they would read something like, keep the Sabbath, and then they would wonder, well, what about this and this and this? So they started developing rules on top of the rules. And when they were finally written down and recorded about 150 years after Jesus lived, they took up 7 extra volumes on top of the Bible. When I filmed this the other day in the library, I actually went down that aisle and found all of those volumes, and I was like holding them in my hand, and it was quite a burden. They were really heavy, and it just helped illustrate that kind of a faith that's only focused on the vertical, that's only focused on the rules and the commands. It reminds me of a conversation I had the other day. I was talking to my father-in-law, and he was telling me about his mom, who was a part of a denomination called Church of God Holiness. And back then, they had a lot of rules. Like, women couldn't wear pants, and you weren't allowed, listen to this, to own a TV. Like, that is how many rules they had. Now, a fun side note, Sally's grandma still owned a TV, but they put it on a cart with wheels just in case the pastor stopped by. They could wheel it into the closet. But that's where a lot of our faith lives are. They're in this place where it's so focused on the vertical. It's all about avoiding sin and nothing else. And then we find ourselves getting tired of that. bored with that because that's not exciting or invigorating or irresistible. And that's where a lot of God's people found themselves. And then Jesus shows up and does something pretty incredible. So Jesus comes on to the scene and does something, well, revolutionary, world-changing even. He comes into that culture that's so based on the rules and the commandments and making sure that the vertical relationship is right, that God isn't upset with us. He comes into a culture where that's at the center of the belief system. And he says this, I'm going to read it to you in Matthew 11 here. He says, starting in verse 28, speaking to a crowd, he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." Now, that may seem a little confusing. What is he talking about? Trading the heavy burdens for the light burden, or trading, the word they use there is yoke. Well, if you were to look up yoke in a dictionary, the literal meaning of it is kind of this wooden thing that would go over oxen to help pull something through a field. It was kind of this weight that would go on top of them. But there was also kind of a metaphorical sense to it, that rabbis would often say that you need to take on the yoke of the Torah, the yoke of the Old Testament and all the rules that's in it. Take that burden onto yourself. Or there's some scholars that also think it could be referring to the specific teachings of certain rabbis or Pharisees. Kind of what are the rules or the commandments that they like to focus on. Kind of like denominations today. So you would ask somebody which yoke they had taken on. And so either one of those definitions kind of fits into this, where they had taken on this system of rules and commandments and making sure that God wasn't upset with you, this vertical kind of relationship. And that can be really heavy. Like when I was at the library yesterday and I was holding all those books, I couldn't have held them for long because the burden was heavy. And I'm really weak, but the burden was heavy. And that's how a lot of them felt about their faith. And so Jesus comes along and he says, "Let me trade yokes with you, because mine is light, mine is easy." And I don't think he meant that in it's not going to require any effort way. He meant that in a simplistic way, that what I'm asking of you isn't rules on top of rules on top of rules. It's much more at the heart of things. And if we want to know what he's talking about, he tells us just later on in the book of Matthew. I actually have it bookmarked right here. I ran out of bookmarks, so I used my dental insurance card, because the tooth will set you free. Sorry. But what Jesus says here in Matthew 22, he's asked by the leaders, what are the most important commandments? And he says this: "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind." He says this is the first and greatest commandment. Now, when he said that, that probably wasn't a huge shock for the people listening. I mean, loving God, it's about that vertical relationship. Give God everything. Yeah, that makes sense. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Here's where it starts getting crazy. He says a second is equally important. So he's not saying there's one here and then one slightly under it. He's saying, no, these two things are equal. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. He says the entire law and all the demands of the prophet are based on these two commandments. See, he goes from saying that this isn't just a vertical thing, this is also a horizontal thing. It's not just about being right with you and God, but being right with you and your neighbor. And then later on, he's asked, who's my neighbor? And he tells a story that basically says, everybody is your neighbor. Even the Samaritans, the people that you're supposed to hate, also your neighbor. All the people you're not supposed to hang out with, also your neighbor. And he says your relationship with them matters. The horizontal matters as much as the vertical. Earlier in Matthew, he says something that would have been shocking. He says that if you're at the altar, praying to God, making sure things are right in the vertical relationship, he says, if you remember that there is something wrong between you and someone else, leave the altar and go and make things right with them. Leave the vertical and take care of the horizontal. That would have been mind-blowing to that original audience, and yet that is what Jesus is teaching them. He's totally turned the faith inside out for them. And I can't imagine just how they were processing that and what that did to how they understood what God wanted. God didn't just want them to follow the rules. God wanted them to change the world by loving their neighbors as themselves. Now he goes on. Jesus brings in the fourth question that I want to ask this morning. He says the question we should be asking ourselves is, what does love require of me? What if we moved our faith from asking, is this a sin, to what does love require of me? You know, I filmed this originally at the seminary because, well, I want to go back to my story for a second. I told you I was living in Springfield, not sure of what I wanted to do, what kind of relationship I wanted to have with the church. And I got offered an opportunity to go work for the Christian humanitarian organization World Vision. So Sally and I moved up to Chicago to work out of the office there. And when we did, I honestly thought to myself, I'm going to retire from this place. To me, it felt like the perfect combination of being able to still work for Jesus, but not have to deal with church people and all the messy stuff that comes with that. But then, after I was there for about a year and a half, I was listening to the CEO at the time, Rich Stern, speak. He wrote this book right here called The Hole in Our Gospel. And while he was speaking, he said this. He said, the local church is the hope of the world. Now, when he said it, I rolled my eyes and I thought to myself, no, I just left those people. But that statement, that moment, planted a seed inside of me, and that seed grew into a desire to live out my calling. And so I began to look for seminaries where I could go and finish my schooling. And my wife grew up here in Overland Park, and I found the seminary in Shawnee. And when I walked into that school, when I walked into that library where I filmed yesterday, I found a group of people that looked at the Bible in a different way. A way that led to that question of not, is this a sin, but what does love require of me? And then after being at that school for a while, I was led just down the way a little bit, down K7 to this church with a weird name, Caw Prairie Community Church. And I found a church that looked at the Bible in a different way, one that asked the question, not is this a sin, but what does love require of me? And that's why I'm here. Because I want to see us to continue to go down that path, to take on the yoke that Jesus offered us, to love God and love others, to not just have a vertical faith, but a horizontal faith. And I believe that when we do that, we can reach out to those that have had bad church experiences, church nightmares. And we can show them a kind of faith that isn't about the rules, but it's about the love of God. It's not about the old covenant that we find in the Old Testament, but the new covenant that we find in the New Testament. And that, I think if we're able to do that, the church will truly become irresistible. I'm excited to preach this message. Let me adjust the camera here. All right. All right, let's do this. Good morning, Cal Prairie. This is Pastor